Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clauser, with the Center Square's Washington State Capitol correspondent, Carlene Johnson, here to talk about the state legislative session that officially went underway on Monday. We're moving into the first week. Already a lot of support behind a so-called millionaire tax that hasn't even officially been proposed yet, I believe. Carlene, you've been moving around the Capitol, talking to lawmakers on both sides. They got another big budget hole to fill this year. How deep did they dig themselves in this time, and how else do they feel to plan that hole?
It's going to be interesting. You and I were, together last week at the Capitol for the kind of pre-session leadership availability, where they kind of laid out what the session's going to look like. And I'll tell you, the first 2 full days in Olympia, when session started Monday of this week, have each day independently felt like a week long. There is a massive emphasis on this millionaire's tax, which of course that's how it's being framed by Governor Bob Ferguson and Democratic majority, who supports the idea of taxing anyone whose gross income exceeds $1 million by nearly 10%. And then the folks on the right, Republicans, who say this is nothing short of an income tax that will certainly trickle down to those who make less money in years to come. So that's been a big theme already in the first couple of days. Lots of discussion about how there could be additional taxes to come to fill the budget deficit. It's just a supplemental year, so it's not supposed to be a bunch of new taxes, but certainly they have options or ways to do that would, tweak previous legislation and increase the tax revenue coming into the state. But Republicans are suggesting, we can rein this in. We can, rein in the spending and not increase revenue. The millionaire's tax wouldn't even start until 2027. So it's going to do nothing to help us in our current budget trouble.
Yeah, and I know Ferguson has kind of mentioned that it's not going to provide any revenue if it passes until years later due to the likely legal challenges that it will face in court. But Ferguson also said in the past month or so, he's not really willing to sign more sales and property tax increases. I just wonder how this is going to pan out with the majority, and whether this is kind of go with his promise last session, where he said, look, I'm not really looking to sign a budget relying on new or higher taxes. And that's exactly what he did.
That's it. And in the Republican response after Governor Ferguson gave his State of the State address on Tuesday, in which he stated that the state of our state is strong, and he hit on a couple of bipartisan pieces of legislation that are out there, and he hit on the response to the recent devastating floods as evidence that the state of our state is strong and that we can all pull together when times are tough. But in the Republican response, which was given by Senator Keith Wagner of Cedar-Woolley, he said, listen, this time last year, when we heard Governor Ferguson give his inaugural State of the State, and he presented a very bipartisan tone and said there wouldn't be, as you just said, those new taxes, he basically said, we don't believe a word out of his mouth now, because he may be setting the same tone now and saying we're only going after the millionaire's tax, which Republicans say is an income tax that'll trickle down eventually to all of us. There's no reason that they have to believe that, because he was unwilling during the last session to look at the no new taxes budget offered by Republican budget writers, didn't even give it any consideration. And as you know, it was, less than 48 hours when Democrats trotted out their budget proposals at the end of the 2025 session. It was like nearly 1,400 pages. So Republican staffers had zero time to look over to even know what the heck they were voting on, but everything got pushed through. So they don't trust him this time around.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how it all plays out, because the majority seems willing to potentially raise taxes. He's saying, look, I'm up for this millionaire taxes, maybe not sales of property taxes, but they still need to fill the deficit. And in doing so, he's hoping to pull $1 billion from the state's rainy day fund. And me and you, we were in that press availability last week, and Representative Travis Couture said it would leave about 3% or only 2 or 3 weeks of operational funding for the state if everything was to go awry. kind of alarming to hear. And I wonder if the majority will be willing to say, hey, here's this $1 billion. Hopefully an emergency doesn't happen again in return for not raising taxes.
They're going to be in support of it. The majority leaders in the Democratic media avail on Tuesday were asked about that specifically. And I think you were watching that as well, Tim, and basically said, yeah, this is why we have a rainy day fund for things like this. And then they kept putting, the attention back on the federal government and what the Trump administration has done and why that is the reason for Washington State's budget woes. Well, anybody who can spend 5 minutes digging is, under the, if you want to find truth in that, that in fact, it's not, tariffs and other things that are the reason why Washington State is in budget trouble. It's because of things that the majority has done in Olympia. So that argument continues, and they seem to win that argument because it seems that most of the legacy media are, repeating that without taking the time to dig in. But I have to tell you, in that this was the first media avail for both parties on Tuesday. And it was the most contentious, and I used the word hostile in a post I put up on X late Tuesday, exchange of questions and responses from the majority. Condescending, yes, very hostile in any questions about the Department of Children, Youth, and Families and the allegations of potential fraud. They didn't want to go down that road. They didn't want to respond to those questions. And there was an attack response that I felt personally, I've got a backbone and I can take it. But, and I did push back on them because I think that's our job as journalists.
Yeah, I think it's important to note here, as they're looking to raise taxes, potentially enact this millionaire tax. They're saying, look, we're going to drain $1 billion from the rainy day fund because this is an emergency. But all the while, the plan to close this budget deficit will ultimately result in expanding state spending. I mean, we had a record high tax increase last year amid record spending, a new record high operating budget, and that will continue in 2026. And meanwhile, they're calling this an emergency. What happens when next year we hit another emergency and then there's only 3% of that fund left over? There won't be that money for us to tap next year. What's going to happen then? We're going to have a millionaire's tax. It's still not 2029. Those still have to clear the courts. I mean, at what point do they draw the line?
Well, that's a good question. And, when we do have these budget troubles, if in fact you have a department like DCYF, which is, I think they had a $770 million budget in the last biennium. If in fact there is fraud going on, I think the average Washington State taxpayer has every right to know and wants to know. If there's nothing there, if there's no there, then we can find it, right? But we've got Representative Travis Couture's bill and some others that have been discussed but not yet offered that would, require some additional accountability, an outside independent audit of DCYF and all of these large taxpayer subsidies. It's worth repeating. So, some folks want to say this is a race-based issue or whatever because the attention has been on Somali-owned daycares and adult home providers. That is the furthest thing from the truth. But there is reason to question when you get on the fiscal.wa.gov website, which anybody can do, and you can search daycare providers near you, put your address in or another, put the Safeway address in near you if you don't want to put your home address out there, and search nearby daycares. You'll find a very large amount in certain communities, especially South King County, South Seattle, South King County, and into Pierce County, where there are a very large number per capita of Somali-owned daycares. And many of them are receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars over a few months' time. And it shows capacity for 9 kids. We've got 6 openings. That means they've got 3 slots, supposedly receiving hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars in a few months' time. Someone needs to explain that to me. That is the question we're not getting an answer to. And at this point, since DCYF is unwilling to answer that seems like a pretty straightforward question. then lawmakers need to step in and require those answers, or at least allow the state auditor, whether it needs some additional funding for an outside agency to get in and do it. It needs to happen at this point to restore, taxpayer trust. It's been broken at this point. It needs to be restored.
Yeah, if the state auditor does dig into it, it's likely once that work would eventually start, it would take months, a year plus to eventually get those answers. So quite the timeline. I mean, Representative Couture last week, he was saying, if there's any state agency or department we should put more funding behind, it's the department, or not the department, the state auditor's office, considering the money that they could be saving us through these audits. But definitely something.
Yeah. I want to add one more quick point, just because I think it's so important. We have to remember that the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, DCYF, is also the agency that oversees all of our children in foster homes, all of our children that are removed from unsafe home environments with their biological parents, mostly due to drug abuse in the home, neglect, related abuse. We have the largest, 2025 brought the largest number of children that were either killed or suffered very serious injury in homes under supervision of DCYF. So this is the same state agency. Now, if there's fraud going on, we'll find that. But we know for certain this is the same state agency responsible for the largest number of deaths in Washington state history. So I just think that's important for people to understand that this is the same state agency, and perhaps some additional scrutiny is warranted because of those things.
Yeah, well, they've seen a massive uptick in lawsuits the past few years. I know the supplemental operating budget proposal that Representative Tim Ormsby put out the other day, I believe it included like $45 or $50 million in DCYF settlements alone. So definitely something that is being put under the spotlight, and something that we'll continue to cover over this session in the months ahead. Carlene, we thank you for covering this and wish you the best as you spend these next several weeks and months in Olympia. And for anyone hoping to catch that coverage, you can read it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.